Thank you very much for this.
So over to you, Lars, with the mind of a bee.
Thank you for the invitation, for the introduction, and it's wonderful to see such a global audience today. Amazing, lots of people. So I've spent the last few decades researching the visual perception, the memory of bees, but surely it's still quite a big step to go from there to talking about the mind of an insect. So I owe you a bit of an explanation. So what I want to explore today is whether an insect like a bee could be said to think and to feel something. And more specifically, I want to ask if bees could be said to have representations, mental representations of things, and of space, and of things in space. I want to ask if there's some sort of access to the past, as well as some planning for the near future, some form of appreciation of the outcomes of one's own actions, and yes, combining memories to form new information. And perhaps most controversially, the question of whether bees might be said to have something like emotions. Now, the appreciation that social insects can do very impressive things is not new, of course. We see here a termite construction, and that's on the left, and on the right, the La Sagrada Familia, the famous cathedral in Barcelona. And if you divide out the scale factor, then these are roughly similar structures. But common thinking is, of course, that these constructions come about by entirely different pathways in the human case versus the insect case. The thinking is generally that in humans, you have an architect, a planner who dreams the whole thing up. And once he has planned out the whole construction in their minds and on paper, they then hand down the instructions to builders, engineers, and so on. Conversely, so common thinking goes with social insect architectures, everything works without a plan. Everyone in that society is entirely pre-programmed. Insects are little robots working together by hardwired rules until they achieve an architecture like that. That's the common view, and this is the dichotomy of bottom-up planning in the insect, bottom-up construction in the insect case, and top-down planning in the human case that I want to deconstruct and perhaps demolish a little bit tonight. Now, the fascination with how insect architectures come about has been around for centuries, millennia actually. And so one of the most magnificent animal architectures anywhere in the animal kingdom is the honeycomb, shown here on the bottom left. And it is indeed unique in its mathematical optimality and how you minimize material use by while maximizing stability, and storage space is also double-sided. So the cells on two sides are interfaced. And if you take a broader perspective across the animal kingdom, then there's almost nothing comparable. So, I mean, birds build nests, beavers build dams, but they're considerably messy affairs in comparison to this really very impressive regularity that you find in honeycomb. And scholars have mused for many centuries about how this structure might come about. For example, Comte de Buffon, a French naturalist, said the following: place together in the same room 10,000 automatons animated with a living force, and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. Now, this is a curious blend of a bottom-up kind of view. So Buffon refers to the insects as automatons, that you just put a lot of them together in a common environment and somehow this kind of structure arises. But he seems to take it for granted that they have feelings, that they are conscious, and then somehow by putting lots of conscious automatons together, they will suddenly build these kinds of structures. Now, it is quite obvious that it takes a little bit more than that. You couldn't put 10,000 earthworms or dragonflies or indeed rhesus macaques together in a common room and they'll suddenly start building something. So it takes a little more than that. And the first person who was interested in the inner workings of a beehive to find out how bees might construct these magnificent structures was François Hubert, a Swiss naturalist. And so he knew, as beekeepers also do, that bees typically start their constructions on the top, as you can see in this image here, and then gradually work their way downwards along gravity to build their constructions until they've reached somewhere near the bottom there. And the first thing that Hubert and his team did to see how this construction might come about is to insert a glass ceiling into a hive box over 2 centuries ago. And what they discovered quite quickly is that bees didn't like very much to attach the foundations of their comb to a slippery glass ceiling. And so what they did instead was to build their foundations at the bottom and then gradually build upwards in the opposite direction in its relation to gravity. And you might say, well, that is still sort of robotic. It's still the same structure over and over. But the important thing here is that had you built a machine, a robot, and given it the instruction to just mimic the natural process, start at the top, use gravity as a reference, build down, that robot would already have fallen flat on its nose with this simple challenge, unless you added a routine to the program of the robot saying, okay, if you can't use the ceiling, use the floor and build in the opposite direction in its alignment to gravity. But you'd have to program that in, or you'd have to give it the desirable outcome, which it then would have to align its activities with, depending on what's currently feasible. Now, Hubert and his team then said, all right, let's make this a little harder. Let's insert both a glass ceiling and a glass floor. And in that case, what the bees did was to start their construction on one of the side walls and build the entire construction laterally through the cavity until they reached the opposite wall. So in this case, it was a sideways construction. But the most remarkable thing happened when, after this construction had already begun, the authors introduced an obstacle, a glass screen on the far wall, the wall that the bees would have reached a few days later had they continued in the same direction. But the astonishing thing was that the bees, that's what you might expect. If they just continue robotically in the same direction, they might have reached this wall B, then realized, okay, this is somehow a slippery surface. Let's reinforce the construction with some extra vertical columns made of wax, perhaps. That's not what happened. What happened instead was, days before the bees would have reached that glass wall, that slippery surface, was that they amended the construction, turned the entire comb basically 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. And the reason why this is so remarkable is that, of course, this corrective action was taken to avoid a future suboptimal outcome, not one that had already arisen. And Hubert at the time exclaimed that I acknowledge that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. So he indeed thought that bees have a kind of master plan and a foresight that allowed them to take corrective action before some sort of disaster happened. So these are historic experiments over 200 years old, and they await verification with modern methods and sample sizes and so on. But in probing the flexibility of an animal in terms of unusual circumstances, they were very far ahead of their time. Now, most of the learning is to be a good economist, to find the flowers that have the best offerings, the best nectar and pollen offerings in relation to the costs that you have to invest in getting to the flowers. So you have to be a careful shopper in the flower supermarket. So bees are not just innately attracted to flowers, they learn the signals as predictors of reward. In any one bee's flight range, there might be 24 different flower species, all differing in the rewards it offers and in the color, scent, pattern signals, and so on. And bees remember these signals as an advertisement, very much like you do when you've selected your favorite toothpaste. Once you found this is a good quality, the price is reasonable, you remember the packaging and return to the same advertisement in the supermarket, unless quality deteriorates or the price goes up, in which case you have to relearn. And that's basically what bees do when choosing between flowers. And in a sense, we capitalize on bees' flexibility in associating almost anything with a nectar reward. So what you're seeing in panel B here is a bee about to land on a little platform with a drop of nectar in front of an image of a human face. And the bee lands there a few times, and we then present it with, well, the equivalent of a crime witness test where there are now multiple different faces. There's no reward, they're spatially shuffled, and we're then asking the bee, hey, can you now remember that particular face where you've previously received a reward? And it turns out that bees are actually very good, about 80% correct choices, even for relatively similar faces. The bees get it largely correctly. That doesn't mean that the bees actually recognize these as faces. It just means they're very flexible in associating basically any pattern with a reward. The other thing that bees have to be good at is spatial orientation. And you might perhaps at one point or another in your life have found yourself in a foreign city where you didn't speak the language, you couldn't read signs, you couldn't easily get directions from passers-by, and maybe your phone was out of battery, and you had to find your way around just using memory of landmarks. Now, in urban environments, of course, this is made comparatively easy because architects want these landmarks to be memorable. They want them to stand out and be different from other landmarks. So it's relatively easy, but still, people do get lost in cities unless they can use technology. Now, a bee's or any wild animal's challenge is more like this. This is a landscape near my second home in central Mexico. And I've deliberately chosen a foggy image because that's how it often looks there. And that is a challenge faced by wild animals. So you might just so make out this tree here, and there might be a nest under it. If you're a bee, you have to find that particular tree. Even after flying miles away from the nest, there are thousands of other trees all looking similar in this image. You have to find that one where your home is, otherwise you very likely die. So there's a very strong selection pressure to have an accurate spatial memory in an environment where there's plenty of opportunity for getting lost. Your next good food source might be somewhere over here. Behind that hillock, there are also dozens of similarly looking hills in that environment. And another pollen patch, protein source might be over here. And you have to remember your way and navigate along it reliably. The way we now study bees navigation is with this equipment called harmonic radar, where this bottom dish emits a signal that is picked up by a so-called transponder, which transposes it to a different frequency, bounces it back, and this is then picked up by the top dish. And that allows us to follow bees through their entire lives. What we're seeing here is the 3D track of a honeybee drone. And of course, since we can track the bee's whereabouts in 3 dimensions, that also means in forward flight, we can basically reconstruct the view from the cockpit of a bee as it's navigating. So what you're seeing here, these boomerang shapes are the eyes of a honeybee drone, a male honeybee. And you can see that the view is quite pixelated. So the visual spatial resolution of bees is quite a bit poorer than our own. But of course, they can, on the other hand, see much faster than we can. So through rapid scanning movements, they can actually compensate for their relatively poor spatial resolution. And so we can set the bees various spatial challenges and see how they solve them using this radar technology. And one typical challenge that is encountered by bees is an equivalent of the traveling salesman problem. And I guess as the name suggests, that is the challenge faced by every traveling salesperson when, for example, in the course of a day, you want to visit 5 cities, and you want to do so in a way that minimizes travel distance, time, energy expenditure, and so on. And so that's what we've mimicked here. So here's a bee nest, 5 locations, and you have to find the best possible solution to link them. And you can see this particular track is clearly not yet optimal, but a bee, of course, isn't given a map to start with. It has to find these locations first and then find a good route. And what we're now doing on the right is we're looking at how a bee over time optimizes this path. So you can see she's now found the 2 first locations, and she's just searching and exploring. Now she's found 2 more. Now she's found the 5th. This is, of course, sped up 100 times. The bout number, this number of sequential flights, is on top left. And you can see that with time, now there's still quite a bit of exploration, but with time, the path gets straighter and straighter until in the end, the bee actually finds the optimal solution and then largely sticks with it. So they're very good at optimizing the routes in these multi-destination problems that we're confronting them with. Now, another thing that we were interested in is asking how a bee might solve its spatial life organization problem when it's left entirely to its own devices. We're now not setting it any task. We're just asking from day one, what do you want to do? Where do you want to forage? And so what we're seeing here is a bee's maiden flight, the first flight she's ever made in her life, sped up 130 times. And the blue dot here is the bee's nest. And you can see that the bee is exploring in various directions, always looping back to the vicinity of the nest without entering it, and then flying out in a different direction. And it clearly remembers where it's already explored because it's not actually repeating loops in the same direction. Also of importance, there's a forest edge here that the bee visits once during this first exploration flight. So that's her first flight ever. Now we're on day 2. And in all of these tracks, green is always early, orange is in the middle, red is late. And we're following the same individual bee using our radar equipment for multiple dozen flights, several days of foraging. And on the next day, the bee makes one more exploratory loop in a southwesterly direction. And now she's found something. She's found a rich foraging patch by this forest edge here. And then does nothing but, like an assembly line worker, flying back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, exploiting that patch. So she's now switched early phase of exploration to one of patch exploitation. Then there were a few days when the bee was stuck at home because it was bad weather. And then she came out again. Green is again early. She flew back to that familiar patch a few more times. And then halfway on an outbound flight appeared to change her mind, flew to a different patch that she had actually visited once before during her first flight 10 days earlier, on day 1 of her foraging explorations, and then stays with that other patch for the rest of her days until on day 13, she just suddenly disappeared, probably having been eaten by a predatory bird or something. But the remarkable thing was that she flew to this location of a distant memory without retracing her steps back to the hive, but flying there without actually going via the hive, as if she really retrieved this from her memory and flying a new route to that location. Now, of course, lots of my colleagues, when they look at these results about spatial memory and color and pattern learning, they will say, well, especially my colleagues working with, say, corvid birds and so on, and clever primates, they would sometimes say, well, yes, bees can learn about space and about colors, but they're pre-programmed to do that. And so we wanted now to challenge bees with problems that they have definitely not encountered in their natural lives before. And so here's a little video explaining a new kind of task.
We've recently discovered something even more surprising about insects. It turns out that some are really, really smart. One test of intelligence in animals is when they're given a problem, they can work out a solution in their heads. Hang a piece of food from a perch, out of reach, and a smart bird like a raven soon works out what to do. Just pull the string, hold it with your foot, pull a bit more, and in no time at all, you have a snack. Yet anything a mere vertebrate can do. Bumblebees can also do this, even though they must be trained to solve the problem. Pull the string and reach a reward of nectar. Now, this bee hasn't been trained at all. But if she's allowed to watch her nestmate solving the problem, she knows exactly what to do when she gets her turn. Teachers and students, and all with brains only the size of pinheads. Combine this with the flexibility of the basic insect layout, and there's not much that insects can't do.
Yeah, so what we've done here is to find out how a technique like this can spread through a colony. And indeed, we can use similar network analyses as people who are interested in how memes spread in social media. They're, of course, interested in where does a new meme originate, who invented it, who copied it, and how rapidly. And that's what we basically did with this string pulling technique in this particular little video. So we're starting with our yellow 31. That's the innovator, the one that first solved the string pulling puzzle. And all the other individuals of that colony are arranged in a circle. Every dot is one bee. And whenever you see a line forming between two bees, that's one of the kinds of pairwise interactions that we've just watched. So one experienced bee paired with a naive observer. And when the target individual turns colored, that's when that individual for the first time pulled a string by herself. And so what we're seeing here now is a whole bunch of orange colored individuals. These have all learned the technique from yellow 31. And now there are a few purple individuals that these are individuals because we've given them a different color because they've not learned it from yellow 31, but from the orange bees, from the second generation of string pullers in that colony. So there are several sequential sets of string pulling bees. And the technique actually in this case continues spreading through the colony even after yellow 31 has passed away. Bees only live a few weeks, so that can happen during an experiment like that. but the technique, the knowledge persists in the colony. And when you have trained multiple individuals like that, they even appear to collaborate, pulling strings together to get to the reward more rapidly. Now, for the next experiment, I'll let Jane Goodall do the introduction.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. He rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
So this, for me, was very moving, because Jane Goodall was, of course, one of the heroines of my youth, and one of the inspirations that made me want to go into animal behavior in the first place. And often primate people are a little arrogant about our bee work, but for Jane Goodall to recognize our work and to say, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bees was quite something. So let's have a look at this experiment in a little more detail, because the social learning element is actually slightly more complicated. What you can see here are 3 balls, and they're all placed at different distances from the goal area, the target. And obviously the best way to solve the task would be, if you're understanding the task, would be to move the closest ball to the goal area. And that's not what's going to happen now, because this bee, the experienced bee, actually knows that this ball and that ball are glued to the surface. They can't be moved. They're stuck. And she knows that, and that's what she does. She moves the furthest ball. This individual here is a naive observer that has no idea how to solve that task. It's just there to watch, basically, and then they both get a big drop of reward at the end. The question then is, if we now put the observer on the spot, will it simply ape the demonstrator and copy the actions that she's seen being performed? Or does she actually understand the desirable end state of the action and move the closest ball? And that is what we're seeing here. And she picks the closest ball. So she does not just ape the demonstrator. You can see she's very clumsy because she's never rolled a ball for a reward before. But she clearly solves the task in a better way, spontaneously, without trial and error, than the demonstrator did, because in this test, they are now not all glued down. They can be freely moved. So there's this spontaneous improvement that tells us that there's some form of understanding of the desirable end state of the actions, rather than a copying of the actions itself. Now, can bees imagine things? It seems perhaps trivial. We now know that they can recognize flower shapes and so on. But that doesn't actually necessarily mean that you have a little mental image of a flower floating around in your head. Your mobile phone can most likely recognize your face, but it doesn't actually have the possibility to think about your face. And one way in which psychologists explore whether there's actually some sort of mental representation of things is a so-called cross-modal recognition test. And that's what we're doing here. We're essentially training bees in a very simple discrimination task to distinguish balls from cubes, or cubes from balls, depending on which group of bee you're in. And then we're testing the same individuals in complete darkness under infrared light, which bees can't see, and see if they can now recognize the same shape using touch. And that's, in a sense, similar to what people did where, well, this might now be an extinct kiddie birthday party game, but the idea was that you were either blindfolded or you had to reach into a bag with some things in it and recognize an object just using touch, like a key, a spoon, a screwdriver or something like that. You'd have to picture it and then find it using touch. And so you can't do that by just using a particular sensory input configuration as you've received it during learning. You have to have some sort of imagination of the object. And it turns out that indeed bees trained to recognize balls in this look but don't touch situation, where they can get food from these balls through a transparent plexiglass lid. If these bees are subsequently tested in darkness where they can't see, but now there's no lid, so they can actually touch it, they're more interested in balls than they are in cubes. And you can do the reverse experiment as well. So in this case, the bees are trained in darkness, in this case to collect their sugar rewards from the cubes. And they're subsequently tested in daylight, where they can now again see the objects but not touch them. And you can see the bee here inspects the balls, has a quick look but rejects them, and now tries again to find the sugar water on the cube. So they can indeed apparently picture these things in their minds, so to speak. So there's access to these object properties from different sensory modalities, even if they haven't been trained to before in these modalities. Now, given all this work about bees and balls, perhaps it's unsurprising that eventually someone in my team, Samadhi Galpayagyu, became interested in the question of whether they actually like playing with balls. And so what Samadhi did was an experiment in which she paired no reward, no sugar reward whatsoever with the balls. She just basically built a little playground where the bees could interact with the balls whenever they wanted to. And it turned out that they came back again and again to this area with containing the balls, just to roll these balls around, so that indeed there seemed to be something inherently rewarding about the activity, rather than actually there being any kind of appetitive reward of any kind. That indicates to us that indeed there is a form of enjoyment of play behavior. And that takes us to the question of whether indeed there are some sort of emotion-like states in the bees. And that, of course, perhaps 20 years ago would have been regarded as an absurd question. People would have brushed this off as either unanswerable or perhaps downright silly. And actually that includes me, because up 20 years ago, I wouldn't have thought this to be worth exploring either. But here's an experiment that changed my mind a little bit in that regard. We were interested here in asking whether bees can learn about predation threat. We wondered if they can learn to avoid crab spiders. These are sit and wait predators that lurk on flowers, and chameleon style can actually take on the colors of the flowers. And we wanted to know, with a laboratory setting, can they learn to avoid them? So what we did was we built these, what we called robotic crab spiders, where the bees could be caught between these sponge-clad pincers and quickly released. See, these are very soft, so there's no injury, just a brief capture, as in an unsuccessful predator attack. And this is how that looks. So the bee lands on a safe flower, nothing bad happens, she feeds, and now she makes a mistake. She lands on a spider-infested flower. So there's no physical injury to the bee at all. And it turned out that with just a few such simulated predator attacks, the bees indeed did learn to avoid their crab spider shapes. But what we hadn't expected was that the whole demeanor of the bees changed. They were very circumspect and scanned every flower before landing. That still might be expected. But the unexpected phenomenon was that bees displayed lots of false alarms, that they inspected a perfectly safe flower that had no spider on it and then rejected it as if they'd seen a ghost. And that happened quite frequently, even 24 hours after such simulated attacks. And that indeed looked a bit, and I'm deliberately anthropomorphically speaking now, it looked a bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder where you're conjuring up threats just from your memory rather than responding to what's actually currently there. And so that, of course, got us thinking about, well, how might one test more formally whether bees might have emotion-like states? And so we borrowed actually a test that is quite commonly used in domestic animals and also laboratory rats and so on, to ask whether they are kept in conditions that are conducive to their well-being or not, as the case. And the test here is a version of the proverbial glass that is either half full or half empty. The optimist might look at this and say, well, it's still pretty good, plenty in there. Whereas the pessimist looks at the same physical stimulus and goes, oh, it's almost already gone, and be all sad about it. And so this is what we took into the world of bees. We trained them into a flight arena where they found either a reward at the far end. So let's say in one group of bees, blue was always associated with reward. So blue is good. And green is never associated with reward. So there's never anything to be had. And we then asked, how do you respond to turquoise? That's now our glass 50% filled. We're asking, how do you deal with the ambiguous stimulus? Does that look more like the good stimulus or the bad stimulus? And it turns out that this depends on what happened to the bees before the experiment. And so after you've trained the bees, you find that whenever they see blue, because they know it's rewarding, they then fly straight there without hesitation. They accept it and fly straight there and hope for their reward. After they've learned, after a number of trials, green is never rewarding, they'll fly about for minutes, puffing about endlessly. And then if you're still not offering them anything else, they might eventually test it, but only after quite a bit of hesitation. And that, of course, can be quantified. And we can then ask, how do you now respond to the turquoise target, closer to the blue one, the one that they know is good, or to the green one that they know is bad? And it turns out that this depends on what happened to the bees before the test actually begins. If you give them a tiny drop of sugar water before the test, then they get a little dopamine hit, which makes them respond to the turquoise or any intermediate target more optimistically than they otherwise would. That's shown here on the right. So if we give them blue, the positive stimulus, no hesitation, fly there with a straight line. If you give them green on the right, the negative stimulus, they will eventually land there, but typically after almost 2 minutes on average. The interesting thing is what happens in between. And if you give them no further reward, then that's the black curve. So you can see the intermediate stimulus in the middle, turquoise, is basically responded to just like the bad stimulus. Then they basically treat it as if it was green and say, well, I have quite a bit of reservation here. If on the other end, they've been given a little drop of sugar before the experiment, they're accepting it with quite a bit less hesitation, much shorter delay time than they otherwise would. And Jerry Wright from Oxford has done the experiment in the opposite direction, where she gave the bees a surprise predator attack before, or simulated predator attack, before the experiment started. In that case, the entire curve shifts in the opposite direction. They're now dealing with the ambiguous stimulus with more hesitation than otherwise. So they are indeed, by the same criteria that are used for domestic animals and so on, optimism-like or pessimism-like states in these bees. Very brief excursion into the magic world of bee brain. So here's a frontal view of a bee brain, and you can see these areas shaded in blue. These are the optic ganglia that code and encode visual information from the eyes. These areas alone in insects have more different types of neurons than we have in our retina. We have about 80. An insect, bee or a fly, has about 120 different types of neurons. So there's altogether a relatively small number of neurons, fewer than 1 million neurons are in a bee's brain. But the complexity is actually astonishing. And of course, everything is very elegantly miniaturized in the bee brain. The impression of simplicity vanishes very quickly once you actually look at the structure of a single nerve cell. This is 1 of 1 million neurons here. This is actually basically the reward pathway signaling sugar reward in olfactory learning. And you can see that this neuron has ramifications through the entire bee brain, which are basically as elaborate as a fully grown oak tree. And now imagine you've got 1 million of these neurons, all of them wired together with up to 10,000 synapses connecting neurons. And so from one neuron to other neurons. And then you have a wiring diagram that is still too complex for my colleagues in neuroscience to comprehend in its entirety. They're now very good already with the connectome of the fruit fly, but the bee wiring diagram of their brain is still a level of difficulty up in terms of complexity. And this complexity, of course, was recognized early on when people studied not just insect brains, but also human brains. And Ramon y Cajal, one of the founding fathers of neuroscience, was quite aware of that. He studied not just, of course, dissected human brains, but also insects, and compared, for example, the brains of insects with those of fish. And this is what he said. This drawing on the bottom here, by the way, is a drawing by Ramon y Cajal, over a century old, a very detailed and very accurate recognition of certain neuron types. And here's what he wrote. The excellence of the psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, their gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, building a marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. So just to wrap this up, I think there is now convincing evidence that bees have mental representations of space and things in space, that there are forms of object manipulation that qualify as simple tool use with some form of awareness of the desirable end state of these actions. There's flexible access to often quite distant memories if you're a bee, and at least by the same criteria that are also used for much larger brain vertebrates, they appear to have emotion-like states. And to me, this is very humbling in a sense, and that I think it does mean that we as humans are thinking and feeling and suffering and enjoying beings in a world of other thinking and feeling and suffering and enjoying beings, however different the sensory, perceptual, and mind worlds of these other animals might be. I think they do deserve our respect and our obligation to conserve the environments that have shaped these unique minds. And if you're interested in this topic, I've got a book out, as was already mentioned. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.